The scar on my left arm tightens whenever the weather turns cold. It doesn't hurt, not at all, but it's a reminder. A raised, fleshy map of the night I died and was somehow born again. They say time heals all wounds, but they're wrong. Time only buries them, leaving behind tombstones that only you can read. The trip started like any other. Mark, with his boundless confidence, had spread the map out on the hood of his old Jeep. His finger traced over the dense contour lines of the Sierra Nevada mountains. He pointed to a small dot near a patch of blue marked as Alastair Lake. "Here," he said, his voice full of excitement. "A place untouched by human feet. Just us and nature." I was a little hesitant. I preferred well-marked trails, places where a mistake cost you an extra mile of walking, not your life. But Mark's enthusiasm was infectious. He was the kind of person who believed that willpower could bend reality. And in that moment, under the brilliant golden light of the California afternoon, I believed him. The first 2 days were perfect. We hiked under towering pines, the clean air smelling of resin and damp earth. The chirping of birds and the babbling of streams were the soundtrack to our journey. We set up camp by a creek, grilled the trout we caught, and told old stories by the fire. The vastness of the wilderness enveloped us, making the worries of the city seem small and insignificant. The feeling of freedom was absolute. The trouble began on the third day. According to Mark's map, we should have reached a ridge with a view of the valley below. But instead, we found ourselves standing before a sheer rock face, damp and covered in moss. There was no way up. "That's strange," Mark muttered, turning the map. "We must have taken a wrong turn somewhere." "Should we go back to the main trail?" I suggested, a cold sense of unease starting to creep into my chest. Mark scoffed. "Go back? No way. It's just a detour. If we head west, we'll get around this cliff and be back on track." I didn't argue. That was my mistake. I let his confidence override my instincts. We headed west, pushing through dense undergrowth and increasingly rugged terrain. The sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The view was beautiful, but I couldn't enjoy it. Every long shadow felt like a warning. That night, we found no water. We pitched our tent on a relatively flat piece of ground, tired and irritable. The sky was starless, covered by a thick blanket of clouds rolling in from the north. The air became heavy and strangely still. Even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. The storm hit around 2 a.m. It didn't start with a few drops, but with a wall of water that crashed down on us. The wind howled through the trees, its sound like an oncoming freight train. Our tent was violently shaken, the poles groaning under the strain. Lightning flashed incessantly, illuminating the forest in ghostly white moments, followed by deafening claps of thunder that shook the ground beneath us. Mark and I clung to the tent poles, trying to keep it from being torn apart. Cold water soaked through the fabric, leaving us drenched and shivering. Then, with a loud tearing sound, one of the main guy lines snapped. The wind got under the fly sheet, and in an instant, the entire tent was lifted and flipped over, throwing us out into the chaotic night. We were left in the middle of nature's fury. The rain lashed my face like ice needles. I couldn't see more than a few feet, even in the flashes of lightning. Mark yelled something, but the wind swallowed his words. We found temporary shelter under a rock overhang, huddling together for warmth, but the cold had seeped into our very bones. That's when I smelled it, a thick, rank odor, a combination of wet fur, rotting meat, and something primordially wild. It cut through the smell of the rain and earth. I nudged Mark. He had smelled it too. We looked at each other in the darkness, our eyes wide with a new fear, one worse than the storm. It came from downwind, a massive shape, darker than the night itself, moving with a terrifying silence. Lightning flashed again, and for a split second I saw it. A grizzly bear. Not a curious black bear. This was a monster, its shoulders as high as my chest, its fur matted and soaked with rain. Its small, black eyes reflected the light with a cold, vacant intelligence. Time seemed to slow down. There was no growl, no warning. The animal was simply there, an embodiment of brutal power. Mark acted first. He shouted, a desperate sound, and grabbed a broken branch from the ground. He swung it at the bear. The bear moved with unbelievable speed. A single swipe of its massive forepaw sent Mark flying like a rag doll. He hit a tree with a heavy, sickening thud. I stood frozen, paralyzed with horror. The bear turned to me. I could see its breath fogging in the cold air. I could smell the blood and dirt on it. Survival instinct kicked in. I didn't run. I knew I couldn't outrun it. I dropped to the ground, curled into a ball, and covered the back of my neck with my hands. I'd read it somewhere. Play dead. Pray. The pain was unimaginable. A powerful set of jaws clamped down on my left arm, its teeth piercing my jacket and flesh as if they weren't there. I felt my bone crack. It shook me back and forth, my head slamming against the ground. I bit my tongue to keep from screaming, the salty taste of blood filling my mouth. Then it raked its claws down my back, its talons tearing through my clothes and skin in long strips. My entire world narrowed to a single point of agonizing pain. I thought, this is it. This is how I die. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I don't know why. Maybe a nearby lightning strike startled it. Maybe it simply lost interest. I heard it snort, the heavy tread of its feet moving away, and then there was only the sound of the rain and the wind. How long I lay there, I don't know. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours. The pain was a crimson ocean I was drowning in. Every beat of my heart sent a new wave of agony through my body. But I was alive. The thought was shockingly clear. I was still breathing. When dawn came, the storm had passed. The sky was a bleak, pale gray. The forest was a wreck, with broken branches strewn everywhere. I slowly pushed myself up, a groan escaping my throat. My left arm was a bloody mess. My back felt like it was on fire. I looked towards the tree where Mark had been thrown. He lay there still at an unnatural angle. I didn't need to get closer to know. I was alone, injured, with no tent, no food, no map, and a bear was still out there somewhere. Despair is a cold poison. It threatened to paralyze me, to keep me there until I bled out or the beast returned. But something else rose up inside me, something harder and more primal. It was the will to survive, not out of hope or courage, but out of sheer, stubborn defiance. I was not going to die here. The next few days were a hazy nightmare of pain and effort. I tore my t-shirt to bandage my arm, trying to stop the bleeding. It throbbed with every movement. I started walking, with no real direction other than downhill, hoping that water always flows down and people build things near water. I ate berries I vaguely recognized as safe, drank from puddles of rainwater. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow took the shape of a bear. At night, I didn't dare sleep. I'd climb a tree, wedge myself against the rough trunk, and shiver in the dark, listening to the sounds of the night and fighting the fever that was beginning to take hold. I started talking to Mark. It wasn't that I was crazy. I knew he was dead. But I spoke to his memory, arguing with his recklessness, apologizing for not being stronger. He became a ghostly companion in my solitude. On the fourth day, or maybe the fifth, I stumbled onto a trail. Not a hiking trail, but an old, overgrown logging road. But it was a sign of humanity. I cried for the first time since the attack. Hot tears streamed down my dirty face. I followed the road. Every step was torture. My arm was swollen and infected. I was running on empty. I just focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Over and over. I didn't see the ranger's truck. I just heard its engine, and then a man's voice sounding like it came from another world. I tried to answer, but all that came out was a hoarse croak. Then I collapsed on the dirt road. I woke up in a white room, the smell of antiseptic in my nostrils. There were tubes in my good arm. My wounds had been cleaned and stitched. It took me a while to tell my story, my voice weak and broken. They sent a search party and found Mark's body. They said I was lucky to be alive. Lucky. I still ponder that word. I lived. Yes, but a part of me died on that mountain, left behind in the rain with my best friend. I brought back scars, both outside and in, scars that will never truly heal. Sometimes at night, when the wind whistles past my window, I can still smell the wet fur and feel the weight of the wild darkness. I faced nature's indifference and survived. But the victory wasn't sweet. It just left a cold truth, etched into my flesh. We are fragile guests in a world that doesn't care if we live or die, and my scar, it tightens as a constant reminder. I'm not new to wilderness exploration, but camping alone deep in Olympic National Park in late October was an act of foolish arrogance. It's a temperate rainforest region where gigantic fir trees rise up to swallow the light and dense fog covers everything from about 4 p.m. I had planned a simple 3-day trip, sticking closely to clearly marked trails. But Like many times in my life, I thought I was too smart for my own good. On the second day, around noon, I decided to turn onto a small side trail that I believed would lead to a beautiful waterfall I'd seen in photos. I had turned off my satellite navigation device because I wanted to challenge myself and rely only on a paper map. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was going too far into it and realizing the trail had vanished. All that remained were wet fern bushes, a thick layer of decomposed matter, and massive rotten logs blocking the way. The sun began to set early behind the treetops. Around 6 p.m., I realized I was completely lost. I spent nearly 2 hours trying to get back to the last marker, but every direction looked the same. The trees here were too tall and dense, making me lose all sense of orientation or the sun's position. The air turned bitterly cold, and the damp chill seeped deep into my bones. I found a small rock crevice, cleared a little space, and set up a temporary tarp shelter. I rationed my remaining food and spent half an hour building a fire. The tiny flame became the only source of comfort in the endless, thick darkness. The feeling of isolation was terrifying. There were no birds, no sounds of large wildlife, only the slow drop of dry leaves. I tried to sleep, but anxiety kept nagging at my mind. The next morning, I woke up around 5:30 a.m. The fog was so thick I could barely see the tree trunks a few feet away. I decided to follow the stream whose gurgling I'd heard echoing in the night. Logically, water always flows downward, and it would eventually lead me to a larger river or an area with human activity. I walked carefully for hours, moving slowly and tiredly on the slippery ground. Water dripped from the trees like heavy rain. I had run out of water and started feeling exhausted. Around 3 p.m., I spotted a sign of human presence, a fairly fresh cut mark on a large cedar trunk. It was too sharp and low for a professional logger. It looked like someone was marking a specific area. Hope surged in me, but it was mixed with an uneasy feeling. This was a non-logging zone. I followed the trace for another half hour until the stream opened up into a relatively flat clearing. There, I saw a patch of ground that had been dug up, not randomly but purposefully, right next to a rotten log. Immediately, my unease turned into alarm. I held my breath and hid behind a large fir tree. I slowly took off my heavy backpack, placing it on the mossy ground without making a sound. I stared intently at the clearing, and now I saw it more clearly. It was a recently filled-in grave. The soil was disturbed, and there were several clear boot prints around the edge. On the edge of the clearing, an old wooden-handled shovel leaned against a stump. This wasn't the work of a casual camper. Then I heard a sound. Not footsteps. It was the sound of metal scraping against rock and the faint grunt of someone struggling to drag something heavy. The sound came from the dense woods on the other side of the clearing. I pressed myself against the tree trunk, my heart pounding violently in my chest. I peered through the gap between the tree and my body. About 30 meters ahead, a large man in a moss-green hunting jacket was pulling a heavy canvas bag out of an old, dark green off-road vehicle parked out of sight behind a cluster of trees. The vehicle had no license plate. The man moved slowly but powerfully. He dragged the bulky bag across the muddy ground, leaving a deep black streak of mud. I couldn't see the contents of the bag, but I knew. That recently filled-in hole was not a pit trap, and this was not a hunter. He knelt beside the freshly filled hole. I saw him take out a knife and start cutting the canvas bag. He did it calmly, without haste, as if performing a mundane chore. When the bag opened, I faintly saw a hand. The hand looked pale and lifeless. Fear swelled within me, but it wasn't the kind of fear that makes you scream or tremble. It was a cold, absolute terror. It paralyzed my throat and my mind, forcing me into silence. I must not move. I must not breathe loudly. I was a witness to a horrific sight, and the only things protecting me were the silence of the forest and the back of this fir tree. He used the shovel to reopen the hole he had filled earlier. Then he used his foot to push the body out of the bag, sliding it into the muddy earth. He began to fill the hole again, this time more thoroughly, using his weight to compact the mud and roots. I slowly reached into my pants pocket, feeling for the satellite phone that was turned off. I had to do this skillfully. The phone screen might light up, or its faint click might betray me. I pulled it out and began to power it on, keeping it tightly covered beneath my jacket. It took an agonizingly long time for the phone to find a signal. This forest was notorious for having no cell service. I didn't dare hope. I saw the man was nearly finished with his task. He was carefully scattering leaves and moss over the freshly filled patch to cover his tracks if I got a weak bar of signal. Only one bar, but it was enough. I tried to keep my voice steady and as low as possible, barely more than a breath. I dialed the emergency number for the National Park Ranger Station. Ranger Station, go ahead. An older woman's voice answered, slow and professional. I am Ethan Miller, I whispered, trying to keep my breath from shaking. I'm lost on the west side of the Void Canyon. I need immediate assistance. Ethan, can you give me exact coordinates? What was the last trail marker you saw? No, there's no time. I've witnessed a killer. He's burying someone right next to a stream. He's filling the hole. The woman paused. Then her voice grew strained. Ethan, stay calm. Describe your location. Are you safe? I'm in the small stream area about 4 miles southwest of the Twin Cliffs, near an area with several chopped cedar trees. The vehicle, an old green off-road vehicle. I can't speak any louder. He's about 30 meters from me. I heard the sound of typing from the other end. We are dispatching a patrol, Ethan. You must move away from there immediately, but do not let him see you. Do you have any means of self-defense? No, I only have a small knife. Send the rescue team. As soon as possible, I will try to move northwest toward the main patrol road. I let go of the phone and ended the call. I couldn't say anything more. I was at risk of being discovered. The man started to clean the shovel and looked toward the forest, his eyes vigilant. I lifted my backpack, moving inch by inch. Every second felt like a punishment. I couldn't run. I couldn't make a sound. I had to blend into the brown and green of the forest. I chose a direction opposite to where his vehicle was parked, squeezing myself between a dense cluster of young cedar trees. I crawled. I didn't walk. The wet moss helped minimize the noise, but a dry twig breaking under my knee could render all my efforts useless. About 15 minutes later, I heard the engine noise. The off-road vehicle had started. I sighed in relief, thinking he was leaving, but he didn't leave. The engine noise only moved a short distance, then stopped. The man had decided to spend a little more time checking the area. I heard heavy, deliberate footsteps. He was walking along the stream. He was checking for any tracks I might have left before hiding. He wasn't crazy. He was professional. He came very close. I lay flat on my stomach, pressing the phone into the mud beneath my chest. The smell of dampness and metal assailed my nostrils. I could hear his clothes brushing against each other as he walked past. I closed my eyes. He stopped. I felt like he was standing right above me, separated only by a layer of cedar roots and decomposed leaves. He didn't move. I held my breath. That silence lasted perhaps only 30 seconds, but it was an eternity. Finally, the footsteps continued, moving farther away. He hadn't seen me, perhaps because the light was too poor and I had blended into the environment too well. I waited. I didn't dare twitch until I heard the off-road vehicle engine revving again, this time moving quickly away, the sound gradually fading into the silence of the dense forest. I knew I couldn't stay. He would come back to check. I got up, my entire body aching and trembling. The clock showed 4:45 p.m. I ran. It wasn't a speed race. It was a desperate, calculated escape. I ran along the stream, no longer caring about the noise I was making. I just needed to get out of that area as fast as possible. About half an hour later, when the light had almost completely vanished, I heard a different engine noise. This time, it was different. It was the sound of a pickup truck, and it was stopping on a nearby road. I stopped, hiding behind a rock. Ethan Miller, a voice echoed through the forest. Ranger Station, we are here to help you. Where are you? I burst out of my hiding place, running straight toward the sound. When I emerged from the tree line and saw 2 park rangers standing next to their truck, I nearly collapsed. I'm here, I screamed, my voice hoarse. They ran towards me. The tall ranger, named Frank, quickly took my arm and reassured me. It's all right, you're safe now, he said. Don't say anything yet. We saw the tracks of that off-road vehicle. Rescue is coming. You did great. I couldn't speak a word. I just gasped for air. I had survived. Somehow, I had survived. After that, Frank and his colleague led me out of the forest. At 7 p.m., I was sitting in the back seat of a police car, wrapped in a thermal blanket. I looked out the window, where the dark cedar tops swallowed the last rays of twilight. That man had left, but what I saw would never leave my mind. My name is Elias Vance, and my job is to guard the boundaries most people never know exist. Blackwood National Forest is not an amusement park. It is a massive granite and balsam fir, a place where civilization dares only to touch the edges. That is why, when I smelled the scent of burning pine wood around 10 a.m., nearly 7 miles north of the nearest trail, my gut twisted. It was a thick smoke, not the gentle kind from charcoal or damp, rotting leaves, but the acrid smell of freshly cut wood being burned in haste. Blackwood's rules are clear. Camping is only permitted in designated areas. This location, deep in the restricted logging and hunting zone, suggested something far worse than a simple illegal picnic. I switched off the pickup engine. The immediate silence of the forest swallowed the sound of the tires. I hooked my Marlin rifle across my back, checked my hunting knife and canteen, and keyed my radio. "Central, this is Elias," I murmured. "I'm heading in to investigate smoke deep in Grid 12B, anticipating radio silence until 3 p.m. I walked into the woods. The terrain became steep and treacherous right away. After about an hour and a half, I started noticing signs. A deliberate clump of pine branches broken off, an unusually deep boot print in the moss, not hiking boots, but the hard, heavy kind. I reached the camp around noon. It was nestled in a narrow ravine, perfectly shielded from any aerial view. The fire had been put out, but the ashes were still hot and smelled strongly. This was no ordinary campsite. There were no sleeping bags, no simple tents. Instead, 2 large tarps were strung between the trees, and on the ground I saw tools, crude, heavy implements used for processing flesh, and traces of blood. The chill didn't come from the dropping temperature, it came from the realization. This was prime elk country. This was a poacher's den. But the scale and organization of the camp worried me. No shell casings, no trash. Whoever had been here acted as if they knew what they were doing and how to conceal it perfectly. I began sketching the camp layout, taking a few photos with my rugged camera. I noticed an oddity. Even though they left quickly, they had taken the time to remove all identifying marks. Even a clear boot print was hard to find. I was inspecting a tree stump when I stopped. Something was wrong. A feeling. The sense of being watched without being able to locate the source. I had spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between imagination and a genuine threat. I slowly turned around, scanning the canopy. Nothing. But when I looked west toward the way I thought I had come, a tree I had used as a landmark, a distinctive Y-shaped cedar, was now blocked from view by a large fallen trunk. I had marked it. I was sure I had marked it. I checked my compass. The magnetic needle spun wildly, rotating full circles. Had someone planted a magnet under the moss nearby? I pulled out my handheld GPS unit. The screen was dark. The battery had been pulled, but the cap was still screwed on tight. An arrangement. I had been isolated and cornered. I knew this forest well, but being disoriented without a compass or GPS, especially with nightfall approaching, was a slow death sentence. I sprinted east, toward where I remembered a larger creek running. After about 100 yards, I stopped. Running would only exhaust me. Then I heard the sound, the crunch of a breaking branch. Not deer, not a wolf. This was the sound of deliberate, measured, and slow human footsteps. They were following my exact path. I pressed myself against a massive moss-covered boulder, trying to calm my breathing. I listened. 2 people, or maybe 3. Their heavy boots scraped over the dry leaves, suggesting no sense of urgency. I realized my mistake. I had underestimated my opponents. These were not just amateur poachers. This was an operation, a group capable of tracking and disabling a seasoned ranger. I waited until the sounds passed, close enough that I could almost smell the gun oil from their weapons in the humid air. Then I started moving, heading north, away from the direction they were taking. I began a new journey, a journey to survive. As the sun set, the forest turned to ink. I relied on the memory from my 10 years of patrols, the shape of the distant peaks, the wind's direction, and the location of the North Star, which I could only faintly see through the thick canopy. Around 7 p.m., I reached a small bluff leading down into a rock cleft. I slid down, using branches for padding. I did this to create a topographical gap and to mask my scent from any dogs they might have with them. After walking along the bottom of the cleft for about a mile, I climbed onto a high ledge and flattened myself, trying to blend into the gray and brown rock. The night was bitterly cold. I had turned off my radio to save the battery and prevent them from homing in on the signal. I lay there for nearly 3 hours. Then they arrived. I didn't hear footsteps, but a faint light flashing through the gaps in the rock cleft below. The lamp moved slowly, systematically. These men were relentless. They knew this area. One man spoke quietly, a low, guttural voice, not a familiar local accent. I only caught one word: over. I understood. They had determined my general area and were sweeping. I had to take a risk. I waited until their faint light was blocked by a large pine, casting a long shadow. I slid off the ledge, moving west, toward a large river I could follow. Running through the night was a nightmare. The wet moss was as slick as ice. Pine roots were invisible traps. I fell several times, my shoulder and hip taking sharp, jolting pain. Around 2 a.m., I reached the riverbank. The water was surging, black and frigid from mountain melt. I had to obscure my trail. I stripped off my heavy boots and slung them over my shoulder. I stepped into the water, the cold instantly piercing my trousers and sinking deep into my bones. I waded upstream for about 500 yards, keeping as close to the edge as possible where the current's roar masked my own noise. When I felt my body approaching hypothermia, I scrambled onto the opposite bank. I walked barefoot for another 50 yards into the woods, then put my boots back on. I couldn't risk the water any longer. It took another hour before I found a shallow rock overhang, just big enough to crawl into. I rubbed my arms and legs trying to pump warm blood back into my extremities. The cold had slowed me down, but it had also lowered my heart rate and heightened my focus. I checked my watch. 4 a.m. Only a few hours until daylight. As I started to drift off, I heard it again. The distant bark of a dog. Not a playful bark, but the consistent, controlled growl of a trained working dog. They had found my entry point into the river. It had to be them. I couldn't stay. I got up, my body stiff from the cold, but the adrenaline warmed me. I grabbed a handful of black mud from the cave floor and smeared it across my face, hands, and clothes, masking my pale skin. I knew this place. Just 2 miles from here was the Grey Wolf Range, an area of extreme danger with sheer, unstable cliffs. I had to lead them there. I couldn't deal with them in an open firefight. I was outnumbered. I started climbing, moving at an angle that required me to cling to rock outcroppings. I listened to the barking. It was closer, angrier. Dawn began to break, bringing with it a cold gray light. I could see the terrain clearly now, which meant they could see me too. I reached a high, exposed patch of ground, overlooking a 50-meter drop. Just above the cliff edge was an unstable field of scree, held back by a fragile network of pine roots. I started running along the edge of the scree, making as much noise as possible, deliberately breaking the crust of loose rock. I heard their shouts. "There he is, on the ridge." I stopped right at the cliff's edge. They were about 100 yards behind me, 2 massive men in tactical gear, one with a rifle, the other holding the leash of a large German shepherd. No time to think. I hurled my boots down the cliff. Both poachers looked down, distracted. Then I turned quickly. I didn't run toward them, but ran straight into the unstable scree field. I used my shoulder to ram into a decaying pine trunk that was holding back the largest rock mass, simultaneously tugging hard on a severed cluster of roots. The sound was like an earthquake's roar. The scree beneath me began to give way. I curled up, rolling over the cliff's edge and grabbing a small spruce tree that had taken root in the face of the rock. The poachers' shouts were swallowed by the sound of rock and earth cascading down the cliff. Tons of material fell, creating a cloud of dust and an echo that vibrated through the canyon. I hung onto the little spruce, waiting for the last sound to settle. I heard a single, strangled cry, followed by silence. After 5 minutes, I started moving. I climbed down the rock face, little by little, until I was safely standing on a ledge below. I walked back to the river, found a faint game trail I knew would lead me back to the restricted Forest Service road. It took me 3 more hours to walk out of that restricted zone, soaked and shaking from exhaustion. When I emerged from the forest, the sunlight was blinding. My pickup truck was still there, untouched. I retrieved the spare radio from my toolbox. "Central, this is Elias," I whispered. "I need a medical team and regional police at Grid 12B. Major poaching incident, contact made." I leaned against the truck, breathing deep and slow. I had survived. Blackwood had granted me that chance. But I knew those men came from a place worse than the forest, and others were likely still waiting. It was the Whispering Pines Forest, late October. The name sounded dramatic, but it was really just a granite mountain range covered in trees, known for its treacherous trails and ancient, fiery red maples. Mark, who considered himself the survival expert, had chosen Whispering Pines. "Just a 3-day hike," Mark said, his arrogant smile only adding to my annoyance. "We'll traverse the north sector, the least traveled area." Joining us were Lisa, who always carried a complete first aid kit and a field guide, and David, the guy with perpetually anxious eyes, whose very presence seemed to add an invisible pressure to the group. I, Ethan, was simply looking to get out of the city for a while. The first day passed like a perfect oil painting, golden sunlight filtering through the maple canopy, the ground lined with a soft carpet of dry leaves, and the damp, earthy smell of autumn. It was hard to believe this beauty would quickly become a trap. The trouble started around 4 p.m. We had been following a small stream that Mark insisted was a tributary of the Eagle River, a crucial landmark on his old, worn map. However, the stream abruptly vanished, its flow absorbed by a large pebble bed. Mark stopped, his self-confidence wavering for the first time. "Maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere," he muttered, kneeling to open the map. Lisa placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, her voice calm but serious. "Mark, we haven't seen a single trail blaze in over an hour. This isn't the trail. We're lost." The sun was beginning to dip behind the tall pines. The temperature dropped quickly, and the damp cold seeped through my wool sweater. We spent another hour fruitlessly trying to find the trail, only to realize we were sinking deeper into uncharted territory. I started to feel panic rise like a fever, but I suppressed it, knowing that if just one person lost control, the entire group would shatter. We were forced to set up camp for the night in a narrow ravine. Darkness descended like a heavy blanket, swallowing the reds and golds of the forest. All night, David trembled incessantly, and not just from the cold. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. The fire was dead, only glowing embers remaining. In the absolute silence of the forest, I heard a sound that didn't belong. Not an owl or the wind, but a heavy dragging sound, seemingly not far away. I held my breath, listening, my heart pounding against my ribs. The sound stopped, replaced by a feeling of being watched, a primal, chilling sensation. The next morning, I told Mark. He just mocked me. "It was a bear, Ethan, or a moose. You're stressed out." But Lisa did not. She looked at me with tired but sharp eyes. "We need to backtrack our steps." "No," Mark stated flatly. "I've studied the terrain. If we keep heading southeast, we'll intercept the old service road. We keep going." I felt a clear division. Mark, with his stubbornness, represented false hope. Lisa, with her cold practicality, represented the harsh truth. David was a shadow, clinging to whoever gave the orders. As we started moving, something sent a shiver down my spine. About 20 meters from where we had camped, I saw a thin steel wire. It wasn't barbed wire or a fence. It was a snare, cleverly hidden beneath a layer of dry leaves. I said nothing. I just used my boot heel to crush the metal loop. I knew bears didn't set traps. Around midday on day 2, we found what Mark was looking for. A path. But it wasn't the old service road. It was a small, roughly cut trail that led to a clearing deep in the woods. There, we found a dilapidated shack built from scrap wood and plastic tarps. The wild world suddenly collided with the human world in a frightening way. This was not a legal campsite, nor the shelter of a hiker. I could smell the sharp odor of chemicals and old dampness. Mark was confident again. "Must be a trapper. We can use this shack for shelter tonight." "Absolutely not," Lisa protested, losing her composure. "Mark, this is an illegal operation. The person here won't want us to stay. We need to leave immediately and follow this trail in the opposite direction." The tension peaked. "I'm not wandering around in the dark anymore," David croaked. Mark grabbed David. "You and I are staying here. Ethan, Lisa, it's up to you two. We'll meet back here at 5 a.m. In retrospect, it was a foolish and arrogant act, but in my fatigue and fear, my reason faltered. I looked at Lisa. She sighed, disappointment etched deep on her face. "Fine, but I'm not sleeping in there. Ethan and I will camp on the edge of the clearing." Mark nodded, too tired to argue. Lisa and I retreated about 50 meters. We built a small fire, just enough to ward off some of the terrible cold. Around 7 p.m., I went to collect more firewood. I stepped past a bush and then heard Lisa scream. It wasn't a shriek of absolute terror, but a sharp, painful cry. I ran back. Lisa was on the ground, her face pale, clutching her ankle. I slipped, she whispered, suppressing a groan. There was a small hole camouflaged with leaves. I didn't see it. Her ankle was swelling rapidly. She couldn't walk. We need to call Mark, I said, but Lisa grasped my hand tightly. No. Don't you see? This wasn't an accident. That hole was too perfect. This is a warning. This is territory. Her words froze my blood. I stared at the dense black forest surrounding us. The light from Mark and David's shack flickered like a lone eye. I realized the sound I heard last night wasn't a bear. It was the dragging of equipment or building materials. We were silent for hours. I bandaged Lisa's foot, but she was still in intense pain. Around 11 p.m., we heard a small, hoarse argument coming from the shack. Then a loud noise, as if something wooden had been knocked over. Then silence. I tried to call out, Mark? David? No answer. Only the chilling silence of the night forest. Lisa gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. They're gone, she whispered. Or, they were taken. We have to go. Now, Ethan. But how could we go? She couldn't walk. I'll carry you, I said. You can't. You're not strong enough. Don't be foolish. We hastily gathered our gear. I stuffed Lisa's bag into my backpack. Around 1 a.m., as we were trying to gate a bend, I saw it. It was a small, faint spot of light, seemingly gliding through the tree trunks about 200 meters away. A flashlight. But it wasn't shining randomly. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if searching for something. Or someone. I quickly crouched behind a boulder, pushing Lisa into a dense thicket of pines. She whimpered in pain, and I covered her mouth with my trembling hand. We were absolutely silent. The light stopped, seeming to probe the air less than 100 meters from us. The person was getting closer. They knew we were here. A cold thought raced through my mind. I could run. I could leave her and run. But I looked into Lisa's eyes, seeing fear and a fragile trust. I shook my head. Moving now was suicide. No matter how fast I ran, the sound of my feet on the dry leaves would betray me. Don't run, I whispered into her ear. We're not running. We'll stay here, silent. This bush is thick enough. I took off my jacket, wrapping it around Lisa's head to cover her pale face and keep her warm. I held her close, the weight of my body shielding both of us from any stray light that might penetrate. We became a silent mass, blending into the darkness and the rotting leaves. My survival instinct was no longer flight, but absolute stillness, challenging the predator. We lay still, my body sheltering Lisa. I heard the flashlight pass by, twice. The person moved slowly, but they couldn't see through the dense bushes. Around 4 a.m., I heard a scream. It came from behind, distant, swallowed by the forest. The scream was a man's, a short, desolate cry, abruptly cut short. I squeezed Lisa. She only gave a small, choked sob. We lay there, unmoving, until the sky began to turn steel blue around 5 a.m. The forest became quieter, but no safer. We have to go, Lisa whispered. Head east. There must be a road there. I stood up, guilt and fear melding into a cold resolve. I used my jacket as a crude harness, looping it over my shoulder and dragging her across the dry leaves. It was a slow, painful process, but we were moving. Around 7 a.m., when the sun was a little higher, we found an old, moss-covered asphalt road. I dragged Lisa onto it. We saw a rotten sign, Whispering Pines Forest, exit 10 miles. I walked, pulling her along, the dry maple leaves crunching underfoot. They were as bright red as blood. The forest had released us, but it had kept the others. Hours later, a logging truck found us. In the hospital, Lisa was treated for a fractured ankle and exhaustion. Lisa and I survived, but Mark and David were not so lucky. This trip truly left too much sorrow and loss, forever etched into my mind.